Okay, we are going to complete our discussion of the 19th century by looking at three artistic movements that happened during that time period. And I feel a little bad because we obviously had to narrow the scope of what we were going to talk about. And there are a couple of major intellectual trends that we just never touched on. And to a certain extent, these artistic movements are expressions of or reactions to these intellectual movements that we didn't touch on. So we'll use this discussion to briefly introduce some of these intellectual trends. What I want the student to get out of this lecture is I want the student to be able to identify the essential characteristics of the three artistic movements we're going to discuss. Okay, Romanticism, Impressionism, and Post-Impressionism or Expressionism. And secondly, I want the student to be able to discuss these artistic movements in terms of their reacting to an intellectual trend or being a product of an intellectual trend. I want to emphasize this connection between intellectual history, intellectual development, and cultural expression. Okay. And the first artistic movement we're going to talk about is Romanticism. This was more than just an artistic movement. This was a literary movement. This was a philosophical movement. And it was a reaction to the cold and scientific approach that the Enlightenment generated. It emphasized feeling and emotion over reason and observation. And artistically, it was a reaction to some of the rigid rules that previous artistic movements had developed in light of the Age of Enlightenment. Some of the characteristics of Romanticism is there's usually a heroic element to it, a hero, be it mythical or modern. It was a return to nature. We see a lot of natural still lifes. We see a lot of vivid landscapes. Nature plays a starring role over and against the human. Okay, it emphasized the goodness of humanity, although this is not always the case. Goodness of humanity, that's one of these characteristics that I read in books, and then when I see some of these paintings, sometimes I struggle to understand how that is an essential characteristic. And one of the paintings we'll look at will highlight that. And these paintings were designed to elicit an emotional response, not a rational response. So we'll look at some examples and how they use color and how they set up their composition in order to generate this emotion. The first artist we're going to use to illustrate these characteristics of the Romantic artistic movement is Goya. And he painted a very, I don't know how to describe it, not disturbing, but it's not hopeful, but it is powerful, painting called The 3rd of May, 1808. And this painting highlighted the cruelty and inhumanity of the 19th century in Europe. It's a historical episode where a bunch of Spanish rebels were being executed by Napoleon's forces for opposing the Napoleonic regime. And this painting was actually done in celebration of the restoration of King Ferdinand in Spain. So it was meant to honor the sacrifice of those people who stood up for Spanish independence and Spanish rights. When you look at this painting, your eye immediately goes to the victim in the white shirt. And light seems to radiate from him. Even though there's a lantern not too far away, it does not seem as if the lantern is illuminating the scene, but the martyr, if you will, is illuminating the scene. And when you look at that central figure, the victim of execution, he is wearing a bright white shirt emphasizing his innocence. His arms are raised and there are wounds on his hands, all of which seem to evoke the figure of Christ, who died on behalf of other people, and he was dying on behalf of his country. Now look at the French soldiers. None of them have faces. They are all striking the same mechanical pose. And this emphasizes the French inhumanity in this execution. They are standing way too close to the subject in order to seem like an actual execution. I mean, this was a shocking event. When you look at the line of the other victims behind the central figure, each one of them has a unique expression and a unique face. And this is in direct contrast to the cold machinery of the French executioners. And if you notice, a third of the painting is this black landscape, this very dark and macabre context in which this is happening. Now, this darkness of the landscape, the gray, steely blue darkness of the French soldiers, is in contrast to some of the warm, light tones that are used for the victims. These warm tones don't seem to fit within this context. But this painting is designed to elicit an emotional response from the viewer. Another example of the Romantic movement that also serves to be a great example of some of our Enlightenment values is Delacroix. He painted Liberty Leading the People, a very famous painting portraying and commemorating the Revolution of 1830 in France. And we see this scene where this lady is leading the charge with her people behind over the barricades, moving forward, right? Progress, right? This is not a historical portrayal. Delacroix did not paint this after looking out the window and seeing the scene. A woman would not have been leading this charge. So who is she? Why is she there? She represents liberty. That liberty is motivating. Liberty is driving this revolution. It depicts a new social order. Okay, if you look in the bottom left-hand side, you'll see a dead man in a nightshirt. And during this time, the monarchy was especially brutal in that they would enter your own homes and beat you to death and drag you out, maybe in that order, maybe not in that order. But this person died at the hands of the monarchy for the cause of liberty. And in contrast to that is the bottom right-hand corner where we see a dead royal soldier. They were vulnerable too. They were subject to death as well. So we have a depiction that a person that died for his country and a person that died because of his country in contrast with one another. And it's over these bodies, it's over this barricade that Lady Liberty is leading the charge with the flag of France in one hand and a bayonet in the other, and her fists are pointed forward. Progress, charging, ever ahead. Now, if you look next to Lady Liberty, you see two other very interesting figures. You'll see a man with a top hat and a gun, and he represents the middle upper class person who is fighting for liberty. Nice dress and can afford a gun, but right next to him is a common person, a blue-collar worker that cannot afford a weapon, but has taken up whatever he has, a sword, in order to defend this cause of liberty. This was the artistic embodiment of the values of the French Revolution: liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. If you notice the technique that Delacroix used, it is not strict realism that he's using. He has this very non-specific use of color, this fog of either gun smoke or early morning fog, but it's not really a defined thing. It's diffused throughout the picture. Whereas an earlier Enlightenment era painter might have shown the contours of this fog or cloud, this just seems to hang in the air. Notice the warm use of colors. And notice that this looks different from Renaissance and Manneristic art. It's warmer. It's less specific. Okay, Delacroix is an excellent illustration of Romantic art. Okay, now the next movement that we're going to talk about is Impressionism. This was a label for French art in the 19th century, where the artist sought to capture just a brief moment in the world, a moment that was there once and is gone forever. They try and capture and memorialize in painting. This is the artist's impressions of the world. In other words, they see the world as making sensory impressions on their person and their feelings and such, and they try to record those impressions. Okay, this was an application of idealism, but not symbolic idealism. This isn't like icons. The idealism is rooted in the real world, is rooted in what you can actually see, but it is one's personal impression of what one sees. Characteristics include loose brushstrokes, or in some cases just the opposite. Little points. Pointillism was another method used in order to portray one's impressions of a scene. Most of the time they were in outdoor settings. And they capture these unique, fleeting moments. And they have a very unique use of color. It was non-naturalist. It was not the color as it actually should have been. It was the color as one perceives it, the impression of that color. And the artist we're going to look at as representative of Impressionism is Monet. There's actually two guys who were Impressionists, a guy named Monet and a guy named Monet, both of which were incredibly popular and incredibly influential. We're going to just talk about Monet. He grew up next to water, and he loved painting water, and he realized his goal was to capture light on water, physically painting out of doors, not in a studio somewhere. And that was relatively unique for his time period. He exemplifies a unique use of lights in the Impressionistic era by how shadows are portrayed. Depending on the shade of light, depending on the quality of the light, you can portray a shadow as being green in color, or blue in color, or black in color. It really depends, but it contrasts with the type of light in the scene. Monet used contrasting colors to depict this separation, not just shades of the same color. So, you know, if you portrayed a blue ball with a light source shining on it, if the ball was blue, the shadows would not necessarily be dark blue. They could be a different color to highlight this contrast. Probably the best representative work from Monet in Impressionism is one called Impression, Sunrise. This painting that portrayed, I believe it was Paris in the morning time, not only is a great example of Impressionism, became the standard for Impressionistic art, and even gave Impressionism its name. And it's a scene where the sun is rising and the fog is still hanging, and we see the sun reflecting off the water. And the sun was very clear because its reflection is very different in color than the rest of the water. It is a contrast between sun and darkness, or sun and twilight. It's not a diffusion of sun in small gradations. It was a contrast between sun and not sun. This captured a brief moment in the sunrise. If the artist would have waited 2 more minutes, the color scheme and the resolution and all this would have been completely different. But Monet chose this one brief moment to capture and record his impression of how he felt at this scene. So when we phrase it like that, we realize that Impressionism and Expressionism are not necessarily separate from Romanticism, but are developments of or extensions of Romanticism. the emphasis on feeling and emotion over reason and observation. Okay, and Monet's Sunrise, Impression Sunrise, is a great illustration of this romantic approach as opposed to a rational approach. Okay, the third movement we're going to look at is called Post-Impressionism. I personally prefer a different label on this. This is also known as Expressionist art, as opposed to Impressionist art. They're very similar, but they do have a different trajectory. In Expressionist art, the artist attempts to express one's feeling about a subject or a moment. It's not simply recording the impression it makes, but expressing something about it. Not just what it is, but what it should be. Okay, that's why I think this is an easier label for this artistic movement than Post-Impressionism, because it highlights the contrast with Impressionism. Some of the characteristics of Expressionism is the use of idealism. Again, we can see this artistic pendulum swinging back and forth, both in the classical world, where we have these early depictions of Corre and Curios, and it swings very drastically towards realism and the Lacan group and Roman art, and then in the Christian area we see it swinging back through the use of icons and non-representational art to idealism, and then with the Renaissance it swings back towards realism. Now with Romanticism it's beginning to swing back towards idealism, and that will find its ultimate expression in Cubism, Surrealism, and the different modern artistic movements that I don't know if we'll have time to get to. But Expressionist art was on this continuum swinging back towards idealism. Expressionism also used very bold colors, where we can describe Romanticism and Impressionism with these warm, pastel-like colors. Expressionism was very bold and forceful colors and very strong outlines. That's also another contrast with Impressionism, where it's this very diffuse, just kind of blending in of different aspects on the landscape. This is simple and direct. It uses very loose and free strokes, and even includes a lot of symbolism. And the artist that immediately comes to mind with Expressionism is Vincent van Gogh. In his work titled The Night Cafe, Van Gogh exemplifies bold and bright use of color. And when you compare this to both Goya and Delacroix, you can see that the colors are very different. If you look at the lights hanging down in the cafe, the way that he chooses to show the diffusion of light is very different than Impressionism. It's not this gradual, diffuse, amorphic, radiation. We see very clear lines that represent the diffusion of light. And if you look closely there, you can even see not just tones of red, orange, and yellow to portray light, but he has green in there. And that's somewhat of an interesting choice for this yellow or white light. But there again, it highlights the simple and direct method of demonstrating how light diffuses. Is not a realistic portrayal of the diffusion of light, but an idealistic or symbolic portrayal. Van Gogh admitted that this work was designed to be somewhat disturbing and represent what he called the most terrible passions in humanity. The room is this very bright, almost blood red, highlighted by very bold yellows and oranges. It's very bright, it's very jarring. And if you look at the perspective of the room, it's askew. It's not a realistic perspective there. And this is this is not a warm, comfortable place where you can hang out and have a quiet evening. This is something different. This is something more intense than that. Notice his use of heavy brushstrokes. These are not fine, gentle lines. These are very bold and confrontational lines. This was not how the room actually looked. This was Van Gogh saying something about this room. Maybe there would be a fight that happened in this cafe later on. Maybe this is where people met to plan trouble. This was not where you necessarily took your wife out for a quiet evening. That's a great illustration of how Van Gogh expresses his feelings about this room. It is not a warm, inviting room. It's a bold, confrontational sort of room. Another artist that is an expressionist is Gauguin. Paul Gauguin painted around the same time as Van Gogh, but made more use of symbolism than Van Gogh did. And one of the reasons why I wanted to discuss him is because he had a painting called The Yellow Christ. And I think it's very helpful to look at art that portrays the same subject in different eras. And the crucifixion does give us this milestone that early Christians used. A medieval period had crucifixion depictions. Early Renaissance art, Manneristic art, every single artistic movement through Surrealism. Salvador Dali has a number of crucifixions that he did. We can see how attitudes towards art change from one period to the next, looking at how they portray the same subject. And Gauguin painted a work called The Yellow Christ. And this was a movement away from representational art, away from realism. If for nothing else, he paints Christ on the cross hanging in a small town in rural England. Gauguin divorces the historical event of the crucifixion from its context, from its proper landscape, from its place and time, and places it wherever he wants, basically. And he did this so that he could intentionally reinterpret not only portraying Christ, but how people should think about Christ. Now, Gauguin used softer tones than Van Gogh did, and he did not use the same bold brushstrokes. He used much lighter brushstrokes. But at the same time, this was his method of expressing something about who Christ is and what his work on the cross did. It's a theological statement as much as it is an artistic statement. And I'm personally divided over this, and admittedly, I'm not an expert in Gauguin. I'm not even an art history expert. I love using art to illustrate intellectual trends, but this is an area I personally want to know more about. I'm torn between saying that Gauguin is ripping Christ from his context, from Christ's original intention to secure salvation on the cross, and from his original context as fully God and fully man, and Gauguin is just making anything he wants out of Christ. I guess that's one way to read it. Another way that I feel about this is that he is placing Christ in the middle of our everyday lives. And I think that there is some theological truth to bringing Christ and his work into a small town in rural England, into our town where we live today. We have to carry Christ with. So, I guess these are varying interpretations of this painting, and I'm going to have to spend more time with it. I'm going to have to read more about it and such. But either interpretations illustrates how art can be used in order to make an intellectual or theological statement. And Expressionism was particularly suited to making statements because its purpose was to specifically express one's opinion on what one is or what one should be, and its use of symbolism and idealistic approaches allow the artist to play around with it, not just merely record what was there like a photograph, but to insert different ideas into these compositions. So I hope our time together in this lecture has given us a better sense of how intellectual trends are reflected in art. And the intellectual trends that is common to these three movements is this romantic feeling, this reaction to the cold, mechanical reason and observation of the Enlightenment, and this return to a warm, emotive, feeling-based expression. We see this in literature through like transcendentalism, and we see this in theology as well, through guys like Schleiermacher and so forth. So this is a very interesting intellectual movement that is reflected in how artists portrayed the world around them. And I hope this is not a finishing point for your study of these artistic movements, but I hope it's a starting point and hopefully an enjoyable one. Thank you.